Hi guys, we're back with lectures 16 and 17, which will cover the interwar years, in which we take a look at how World War II came about and eventually how the United States will become involved in this conflict. I want to begin our discussion by going back in time to the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. If you'll recall, the terms of this peace settlement between the Allies and Germany were quite harsh. Germany's military was drastically reduced in size. The country will also lose about 13% of its pre-war territory. They had to accept full blame for starting the war with the War Guilt Clause, or Article 231. And we'll also see that economically, Germany is suffering under the enormous reparations or war debt that they owe the Allied powers. Remember, much of Germany's infrastructure was destroyed during the Great War, so they're having to rebuild and get their factories back online at a time when they're saddled with this huge debt. Inflation in Germany, immediately following the war and throughout the 1920s, soon became a huge issue, as you can see from the chart that I have here on the slide. By September of 1919, you have almost 500 German marks needed to purchase 1 ounce of gold. You move forward in time to September of 1923, for example, just 4 years later, and now it takes 269 million German marks just to purchase 1 ounce of gold, and that number just keeps creeping higher. And while the Dawes Plan of 1924 did ease Germany's dilemma a bit, what we're going to see is when the great stock market crash of 1929 occurred in the United States, it quickly had a ripple effect on all other economies of the world. So before long, Germany was in the midst of another deep financial depression as well. Many German citizens were also deeply humiliated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Why should they, for instance, have to accept full responsibility for starting the war? There was plenty of blame to go around with other powers. I mentioned that Germany lost about 13% of its pre-war territory, including some key industrialized regions in Upper Silesia, which were given to Poland, or Alsace-Lorraine, which was handed over to France. These perceived injustices continue to rankle with the German public, so much so that it's not surprising that a young politician during the 1920s by the name of Adolf Hitler will manage to capitalize on all of this discontent among the German citizenry to catapult himself to a position of authority. Adolf Hitler spoke persuasively before his countrymen, arguing, for instance, that Germany could have won the Great War if it had continued fighting. This was a bold lie, but this sounded good to the ears of embittered Germans. Oh, really? I haven't heard that before. You mean we actually could have prevailed against the Allied powers? This rhetoric was so popular with the dejected German people that he was able to legally rise to power to take over the office of Chancellor in 1933. He also talked about restoring Germany's status on the world stage by casting aside the restrictions on their military. He will withdraw Germany from the League of Nations in 1933 in a defiant move to the victors of World War I, who had created Article 231. Germany also began seizing land in Europe to make up for that which it had lost after the Great War, taking over the Rhineland in 1936 and annexing Austria in 1938, both violations, of course, of the treaty. More insidiously, he began labeling all other races as less than human, singling out the Jews in particular as supposedly inferior. In fact, Hitler even argued that they were responsible for the current economic crisis, another bold lie. Hitler also claimed that it had been the Jews who had been responsible for ending World War I prematurely, leading to Germany's defeat. This despite the fact that more than 100,000 Jewish soldiers served in uniform for Germany during World War I. The lies will keep coming. In essence, the Jews became the scapegoats. They were blamed for every problem during the period. And this is what your average German citizen wanted to hear. They didn't want to think that their current economic crisis or their loss in the Great War was their fault, better that it was someone else's fault. So in order to counter the alleged threat of the Jews, Hitler began systematically depriving German citizens of Jewish heritage of their rights. By 1940, the Jews had all been forcibly resettled into ghettos, forced to wear identification armbands. They had to endure seeing their homes and businesses ransacked and destroyed by Hitler's Nazi police. And even more ominously, in the coming years of the war, Jews across Europe, along with other populations, would be herded into concentration camps to be slaughtered by the millions. Just like Germany's difficult financial situation during the 1930s led to the rise of a dictatorship there, we will see around the world that this global depression following the stock market crash of 1929 will lead to 25 countries around the globe turning into dictatorships between 1929 and 1939. During times of fear, people gravitate towards so-called strong men, individuals who claim that they have all the answers. In Italy, we'll see the rise of one-man rule under Benito Mussolini. He, too, like Hitler, used military spending to provide jobs for the unemployed. He was aggressive in seeking to restore Italian pride on the world stage. For instance, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and in 1939, Albania was invaded by Italian troops. Japan will also become much more aggressive on the international stage in the 1930s, not just for national glory, but also because their small island nation needed access to more natural resources such as oil and rubber. So in 1931, Japan seized the northern Chinese province of Manchuria and other parts of northern China in 1937, resulting in a long and brutal suppression of the locals there. Japanese torture and murder of civilians during the occupation of the city of Nanjing is legendary, where some 300,000 men, women, and children were killed outright, and tens of thousands of Chinese women were raped and kept as sexual slaves for the occupying Japanese army. The leaders of these three countries will ultimately find common cause. Italy and Germany will form a mutual military alliance by 1936, known as the Pact of Steel, and just 4 years later, by 1940, Japan will also join this particular alliance. As you can see from the map that I have here on the slide, it shows the territorial aggressions of Nazi-era Germany as well as Mussolini's Italy during the period. Moving to the Pacific, you can see Japanese expansion before 1941, how they've taken over areas of Manchuria and northern China. They've taken over French Indochina, what we think of as present-day Vietnam, portions of Cambodia, and they are moving through the Pacific to take up island chains as well. Now, while President Roosevelt had been focused on establishing and growing his New Deal programs to help the country out of the Great Depression, he's also keeping an eye on this the growth of this aggressive nationalism for Germany and Italy and Japan during the period. The military buildup of these nations were all clear violations of the League of Nations Charter, but he's also constrained by the fact that many in the United States would still prefer isolationism, that the United States not become involved in events overseas. In fact, part of what landed FDR in the presidency in the 1932 election was his commitment towards scaling back American involvement abroad. Roosevelt had laid out his good neighbor policy in 1933, in which he basically went against what Theodore Roosevelt had said, saying that the United States did not actually have the right to interfere in the domestic affairs of Latin American nations. He will withdraw U.S. troops from Haiti and Nicaragua and give Panama more political autonomy. These were wildly popular moves during the period. Most Americans were still struggling with, the effects of the Great Depression, and so they were not in any way interested in the United States becoming involved in international affairs. Congress will capitalize upon this prevailing sentiment and pass the so-called Neutrality Acts between 1935 and 1937. These acts were designed specifically to avoid the United States becoming entangled in the affairs of foreign nations to the point where the country might ultimately have to go to war. So, for example, the Neutrality Acts will prevent the United States from selling arms or military equipment to foreign countries, and will also establish a cash and carry policy, meaning that if your country is at war with another country, we'll sell you some things, but you need to pay cash up front. We're not loaning you any money, and you have to come get it. The United States was now committed to not sending American ships into war zones for fear that they might be targeted, sunk, and that this would lead to the U.S. becoming involved in another war. Britain and France, for their part, were also interested in avoiding war, and we'll see that both countries will pursue a policy known as appeasement towards Adolf Hitler. Appeasement means basically to sort of give in to the demands of someone with the hope that their demands will stop at that point. I've already mentioned, for example, Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938. They will then go on to take over the Sudetenland, a portion of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France will meet with Adolf Hitler at the Munich Conference in 1938, and hoping to avoid war, they will agree, they will acquiesce to Germany's seizure of this territory, so long as this is where it stops. They said, you know, if you're going to take over this territory and not take over any more, fine. But if you decide to go after Poland, then that's it. And Adolf Hitler promised, you know, he gave his pinky swear, his Boy Scout promise, I'm done, I won't do anything else. And Britain and France took him at his word. You must understand that this policy of appeasement was not because Britain or France were afraid of Adolf Hitler. Instead, both countries had suffered enormous losses in the Great War. Their economies were in tatters as well due to the global financial slump. They could literally not afford another war at this point, so they were trying every last chance they could, pursuing every opportunity to avoid war, hence this policy of appeasement. However, Hitler was just biding his time. He was secretly building up his troops, making a plan to unleash war, and his agreement with Britain and France meant nothing to him because, of course, he lied all the time. So we will see that the following year, in 1939, in September, Germany will break all of its promises and invade Poland. This is the final line in the sand. Britain and France will finally declare war. Roosevelt was forced to be impartial. He could not express any preference either way because most Americans were isolationist. They didn't understand what the war was about. All they knew is they didn't want to become involved. So you see groups like the America First Committee, which will urge the United States to remain neutral during the war. But the United States is not truly neutral. We trade quite a bit, especially with Great Britain. And as the war began and Hitler's policy of blitzkrieg or lightning war unfolded, we're going to see a tremendous amount of territory coming under Nazi domination within a very short period of time. And in fact, France will fall to German aggression by June of 1940, leaving really only the United Kingdom or Great Britain in the West as the remaining Allied power to hold off German aggression at that point. Roosevelt will start putting pressure on the U.S. Congress to repeal the Neutrality Acts. He wants to be able to provide assistance to Great Britain and the other Allied powers that will come into the war, such as China and also eventually the Soviet Union. So the Lend-Lease Act will be passed, allowing the United States to loan or lease items to these countries. Did we expect all those bullets back? No. Did we expect, all the money that we had sent to be repaid? No. This was a stopgap measure so that the United States could buy time before they got into the war and also assist the Allies. By 1940, FDR was already coordinating strategy with Winston Churchill, by that point the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He knew that the United States would likely get into the war, and both men began a series of secret meetings. In October of 1941, a U.S. ship, the Reuben James, was destroyed by the German Navy, which inflamed anti-German sentiment. Hitler will be careful not to try to bring the United States into the war just yet. He's not afraid of the U.S. He just wants to finish his business in Europe before turning to the U.S. So it won't be Nazi Germany that will bring the United States into the war. It will be one of their allies, Japan, with the bombing at Pearl Harbor. More on that in our next lecture.